Hello everyone, Marco Montemagno here, founder of Tech Alchemist, and today I'm so happy to have here a great guest and the person that I really appreciate a lot, even if it's the first time that we meet here today in chat, and is Brad Feld. Hi Brad, thanks for joining.
Hey Marco.
All right, so if you don't know who Brad Feld is, well, just go and Google it because it will be too long. But basically, Brad, I would say the best 5 things that come up in my mind when I think about you: Techstars founder, Foundry Group co-founder, and author, several books. Startup Business, I think, is out right now, probably the end of this month. Yeah. And also Startup Life is coming out in 2013 about life in the startup world. And Marathon Runner, this is a personal thing, but I was really enjoying it. I think you have also on your website your marathon timing, right? The time you did. And you also wrote a post recently about Paul Ryan and marathon time and politician do not match. So this was also very cool. I really like it because you have to know, and then I start with the questions, but I was really intrigued by Techstars and by your activity when once I was reading Do More Faster, which is one book that you wrote with Devin Cohen, the other founder of Techstars. And I discovered that there is a table tennis championship for Techstars, and I was a table tennis professional player, number 250 in the world. And I thought, gosh, that's amazing, you know, these guys, they do something cool. So I was even more in love.
Someday you and David need to play because he is by far the best
player.
Table tennis player, yeah.
So that's cool. So, Brad, I have several things that I want to talk with you today. And basically, when I thought about inviting you, I thought, okay, we live, everyone who is doing business, startups or entrepreneurs, but also freelance and people who want to do stuff online. We have so many billions of things changing and new things and so on. So I thought we need a set of rules. And who better than Brad Feld can help us to get a set of rules, you know, about several topics. And I would like to talk about investing, promotion, entrepreneurship, so several topics that I really would like to join us. So the first thing is you are out with this book, Startup Business. And I thought that was amazing, the job that you did in Boulder, which is not Silicon Valley. You know, from in Europe, we think about Silicon Valley. But when Techstars came out and Boulder started to be an important city for startups, everyone thought, where is Boulder? I mean, it was something strange, you know? But you created a kind of framework, I think, a kind of thesis in your last book. So I would like to understand a little bit better if you can elaborate on this, because I think it's interesting. It's an holistic view about business, and it's not only your business, but how to build an ecosystem. So I would like to start from here.
Sure. So I wrote the newest book which came out. It's called Startup Communities, Building an Entrepreneurial Ecosystem in Your City. And it's built on the premise that you can build a long-term, sustainable, vibrant entrepreneurial ecosystem anywhere in the world. So I have been a long-term believer that pretty much any city can sustain startup activity and startup culture, that you don't have to be in a place like Silicon Valley to be able to create something significant. You know, throughout the United States, there's a bunch of cities that you identify with startup activity: Boston, New York, Seattle, and you know, Boulder was a good example because there was always a lot of startup activity in Boulder, but it's a relatively small place. It's only 100,000 people. So, you know, I spent the last 15 years working with a bunch of other entrepreneurs here in Boulder, doing lots of startup stuff. And a couple of years ago, I started reflecting on what had happened and what had caused us to create something that's so magical here in Boulder. And that led to what I'm calling the Boulder thesis, which is at the core of the Startup Communities book. So I have a framework, and you know, within the book, we explore the framework in depth. But the framework is very straightforward. It's 4 specific principles. And my view is that if you want to create a long-term, vibrant entrepreneurial ecosystem, you have to do the following 4 principles. The first is that the startup community has to be led by entrepreneurs. So there's lots of different people that contribute to the startup community activity, but the leaders have to be entrepreneurs. The second is that these entrepreneurs have to take a very long-term view, at least 20 years. So the idea is that you're committing over a very long period of time to work on, develop, and grow your startup community. The third is that you have to be inclusive of anyone who wants to engage in the startup community in any way. So startup communities, to be successful long-term, have to be organisms that grow and expand over time, not ones where people are playing a zero-sum game. You have to really, anybody who wants to engage, whether they're another entrepreneur or somebody moving to town that wants to work for a startup, or somebody from a large company or government that wants to engage and help the startup community, you have to be inclusive of all of that. And then the last is that you have to have a series of activities and events that engage the entire entrepreneurial stack. What I mean by that is that if you're an aspiring entrepreneur, first-time entrepreneur, multi-time entrepreneur, service provider like a lawyer, accountant, a venture capitalist investor, angel investor, university, there have to be stuff that cause all of those different participants in the entrepreneurial stack to be able to engage. And this is not cocktail parties and award ceremonies, but it's real stuff where you're doing work on a continual basis. Startup weekend, accelerators like Techstars, monthly new tech meetups, weekly open coffee clubs, week-long startup weeks, these kinds of activities that are substantive, that allow people to work on this notion of startup together. So if you take those four principles and you look at the startup communities that have really developed over time, over a long period of time, and have sustained, they all have some combination of those four things front and center.
Okay. Do you think, I just give you an example. I've been moderating 3 days ago. It was a huge event in Italy, TechCrunch Europe, that was in Italy. 1,300 people, a lot of really amazing. So it was the ecosystem, I would say, mostly Italian, but it was an ecosystem. It was something impossible. Only 1 year ago or a couple of years ago was something impossible. So I would say that what you're doing with Techstars or Y Combinator has got a big impact all over the world. So a lot of ecosystems start to grow.
Yep.
Do you think that this is something that will have a substantial impact on traditional business, or will be something just limited to the tech web digital space?
Now, I think it's having a profound impact on business in general. In the book, I talk early on about the difference between hierarchies and networks. And if you think about the world that we operate in today, much of the industrial era from the early 1900s through the late 1900s into the early 2000s were driven off of hierarchical models. Government runs off of a hierarchy. There's a boss, the president or the prime minister, and there's a hierarchy below that person, and there's sort of line of control. Military is a hierarchy. It's very clear who's in charge and who's the boss and who's the boss of the boss, and
command and control system.
Right? So think about a hierarchy, and most big business works in a hierarchy. You have a president, you have vice presidents, you have directors, and on and on and on down the organization. Startup companies generally function in a network. They're very early on. The entrepreneurs tend to know each other across companies. A startup community, by definition, is a network because you don't have a single leader. There's no president of the Boulder startup community. There's no vice president of membership and vice president of education and vice president of finance. There's just a bunch of entrepreneurs doing stuff. And there's this sort of network that is intermingled. And as a society, we're getting very used to this idea of a network. Your interaction with me is an example of it. I don't know you. You don't really know me, but you have a lot of information about me. You reached out to me. I said, absolutely, be happy to, spend a little bit of time with you. There was no gatekeeper. You didn't have to apply to get me on your podcast, on the video cast. You didn't have to ask permission. So that dynamic, I think, is now really radically changing, this sort of notion of hierarchy drifting into network. I think that we've also conditioned ourselves as individuals to be very comfortable with the notion of a network. If you think about social networking, whether it be Facebook or LinkedIn or Twitter, sort of the linkage between people is something that the computers are really enabling in a different way, crossing time and space. We're in different countries, we're in different time zones, much, much easier. So that construct, I think, is changing the way we work as a society. And on top of it, if you look at job growth and job creation, almost all the new job creation is coming from startup companies. Most big, large companies are contracting. Some of them grow through merger and acquisition, but the real vector of growth is from startup activity. So I think that network philosophy and how that impacts people and companies is pervasive.
That's very interesting. But last week I was watching this Clay Shirky TED video about how it's changing also for politicians and GitHub model applied to politicians. So I think it's very, very interesting. I stay last question about this topic, and then I go to investing and so on. But I was very interested, and obviously I still have to get the book. The interesting thing is also the time frame. You say 20 years. And this is also very, very interesting for me. I got an interview with Jeff Bezos a couple of years ago, and I remember that I was shocked when they said, okay, we enter Italy, and Amazon open on the Italian market, and then I say, how can you compete, with these leaders that they have really strong position and everything? And he said, well, I will just wait 20 years. I have no problem in waiting. And I thought, wow, that's a long view, a long vision. So time frame is so important.
I think it is for a couple of reasons. One is most companies anyway take a long time to develop from scratch. So, every now and then you hear of a company that has huge success in 2 or 3 years, but the vast majority of startups are 10, 15, 20-year journeys with lots of ups and downs. On top of that, if you look at the normal rhythms of society, government runs in 2 to 4 year cycles, university runs in a 1-year cycle, and big business runs in a quarterly cycle. Startups and startup communities can't focus on that short-term cycle because you're playing something that is a very long-term game. So I like to say it's generational. You have to really commit for an entire generation, which is about 20 years from today. And I actually assert that you really should be recommitting every year to another 20 years. So if you look at Silicon Valley is not a 10-year-old phenomena. It's 50, 60, 70-year-old phenomena. And so building a startup community and having it grow is something that has to survive the macroeconomic cycles, has to survive the cycles of government, has to survive the cycles of the one big company in town as they grow up and shrink and grow up and shrink. Entrepreneurs don't need to think about that shorter term cycle. They need to be playing a very long-term game like the one that Jeff Bezos described. And it's especially true in the notion of creating a durable and sustainable entrepreneurial ecosystem.
During this process, obviously there are a lot of failures. And by the way, if for the people watching this video, if you haven't seen Brad talk at TEDx Boulder, I think it was 2010, a couple of years ago probably, yeah. that talk. Was an image that I really love, was welcome to fail, like welcome to the town of fail. And you were talking about mastering failure and so on, and everyone talk about the importance of learning by failures. But actually, you fail a lot during this process. What are your tips? I mean, okay, you fail, but it's never great, to say, okay, I failed. The feeling is not so good. So, in your experience, what can you do to learn and go on?
It sucks to fail, but that's part of the experience. And so I encourage people to accept the reality that part of what happens in your life is lots of failure, and part of what happens in an entrepreneur's journey is lots of failure. And the great entrepreneurs know how to learn from the moment of failure and extract from the failure new knowledge, new experience, new information, pick themselves up and go forward. So even if you look at a successful business from a startup to some great success, there's a lot of failure along the way. It's not the case that you start here and you end here and it's a straight line. It's a line that looks like this. And as long as that line is sloping up over time, you're okay. I think the other thing I tell people is not to be embarrassed by failure. I've had lots of things that I failed about. I'm public about them. I learned from them. Sometimes I repeat the same mistake more than once, and sometimes it takes you a couple of times to get it. But that's part of the experience of trying new things. And if you're ashamed of it, if you're hesitant about it, if you hide it, then you don't really embrace the forward progress of what you're trying to do. In the context of startup communities, we talk about it a lot. We encourage people to just try stuff. And if it doesn't work, or if nobody shows up, or if you do it and it's not that interesting, stop. Didn't work. Try something else. Well, it didn't quite work, but I think it's really important to get it right, so I'm going to fix it. Well, it might be, but make sure you're still committed to that idea, because if you're not, and you're just trying to struggle through it to try to get it to something successful, unless you believe in it, don't waste your time on it.
Another topic is obviously investing, okay? Funding and the VC world. For people who are not inside the startup world, maybe traditional business are used to go to the bank, ask for money, and then they have to give back to money. So for people who is not in a startup business, just remember the venture capitalist and angel world is a explosive world. I mean, I think Foundry Group just closed a $225 million funding. So, by the way, congrats, brother. And and it's very interesting. And I think also this crowdfunding, or I see Funders Club coming out from Y Combinator. So different ways of getting funding for your business. So I want to try to understand, Brad, who do you invest on in this moment? Who are you looking for? Who would you give your money to? I mean, what are your guidelines or your tips to say, okay, if I'm looking for funding, if I really need funding, probably those are the rules to follow, in your opinion?
Sure. So Foundry Group has I have 3 partners. The 4 of us have a very specific lens that we look through when we invest in companies. We are early stage software internet investors. We're focused on companies within a set of themes of ours. So if you go to foundrygroup.com/themes, you can see the themes. If a company is outside of our themes, we don't spend time with it. If it's inside our themes, we go very, very deep with both the product and the people. And our determination is whether we want to be long-term partners with people around the product or the technology that's being created. We also limit ourselves to only investing in companies in the US, and that's a function of experience that I've had in the late 90s, where I made about a half a dozen investments in Europe. And it was just really hard. The geography, time and space, culture was too difficult not being local. So I really felt like while we could invest all around the US, we were having a difficult time, or it would be very difficult for us to be good at investing in different geographies. And the other, as I said, we're early stage investors. So if a company's raised more than about $3 million, it's probably too late for us. We're not a good target to invest. So we define this sort of category of things pretty carefully. And what I encourage entrepreneurs to do is don't view venture capitalists as a single archetype. There's lots of different types of venture capitalists, and what's important to know is to understand the strategy that the particular firm you're approaching uses. And if what you're doing doesn't match the strategy, don't waste your time, because the chance of you getting financing from that group is extremely low. Look for firms whose strategy and the type of things they invest in match what you're doing. And if you can get sort of within their box of what they like to invest in, then you have an interesting conversation.
I also guess that it's not only the money, you know. I mean, if I was a US company and I go in attending Techstars, probably I'm looking for more than money, you know, mentorship networks and all this kind of stuff.
Well, and I separate clearly between Foundry Group and Techstars. So I described what we look for at Foundry Group. At Techstars, you know, we have about 100 companies a year go through different Techstars programs in the U.S. Boston, New York, Boulder, Seattle, and San Antonio. And then there's a number of other accelerators like Techstars all around the world that are part of something called the Global Accelerator Network. And they're not owned and operated by Techstars, but they're affiliated and they share best practices. In the context of Techstars, those 100 or so companies a year that go through Techstars, we like to say that we're focused on people, and then idea. And the only reason we have idea in there is to emphasize how important the people are. And we're interested in the idea. It's not that any idea works, but we really care about the people in that context.
Yeah, everyone think that if they have to start a business, everyone. I think the recurrent problem that come to me is, oh, I have a great idea, but I don't want to say my idea. I don't want to tell my idea, otherwise someone will steal. Or everyone focus on how important an idea. But today, if you talk with investors, or if you hear what the experts say, finally people are the most important asset and resource, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
So innovation. I heard you talking about Eric von Heppel, your professor at MIT once, and you say that he was teaching to consider that innovation is created by users. And I fell in love with this mantra, and I thought, wow, yeah, that's exactly the way to follow. Can you help me? Can you help us to understand better for a business that has to innovate to survive? Because to survive in this era where every 3 milliseconds something change, you have to keep on innovating. What's your advice? I mean, what can you do? Because you have a business that has got some kind of vision and resources, so you can't change everything every 2 seconds. Otherwise, it's difficult to run your business. So how can you adapt in this kind of situation? Correct.
Well, so Eric von Hippel was about 30 or 40 years ahead of his time, because his notion and the statement that he made that innovation comes from users was an idea he had in the 1970s that he's evolved over the last 40 years. So it's a really powerful construct. And if you think about innovation today, the vast majority of innovation does come from users. And constructs like open source software, or constructs like the lean startup that Eric Ries has popularized, is really a very clear sense of a feedback loop that comes from putting your idea and your innovation out early, getting people involved in using it and giving you feedback, and then incorporating that feedback directly into the next iteration of the product, where those iteration loops are very tight, very short in duration. And I think it's incredibly important. It's the best way to develop software is not to sit in a cave for a year and build a bunch of stuff and then spring it on the world, but instead constantly be putting stuff out there and getting feedback from the people who are using it every day, which will help you understand better what you should be spending your time on. And I think Eric Ries does an amazing job in the book, The Lean Startup, of helping create a framework for how to do that. And there's a whole discipline that's now been created from that. But I think that construct is really what Eric was talking about in the 1970s. It wasn't that there's these big R&D labs where people are sitting working on figuring out what the users might need. Now, it's interesting. There's the counterexample, which is that, yeah, but isn't Apple successful because of the brilliance of, one man, in this case, Steve Jobs, who figured out what everybody wanted, and that's exactly what they got. And I think there's a lot of subtlety to it, because in fact, the brilliance of it was him both thinking ahead of where everybody was, but also synthesizing as a user what was needed. So if you think about the notion of user-driven innovation, an individual within a company can be the user, right? It's not just the case that you have to have somebody outside that's doing it. So there's a lot of subtlety to it, but it's a very powerful construct when you step back and say, okay, how can I get input into what I'm doing to make it more valuable? How can I observe what people are doing with my product so I understand what's working and what's not working?
Right. Eric Wright, Steve Blank. I mean, there is a huge movement, I would say, now to divulge all these concepts very, very...
And, the linkage between Eric Ries and Steve Blank is that Eric was Steve's student. So Steve came out with this notion of customer-driven development, and Eric evolved it, and put it to practice, and evolved it, and then sort of codified it. And the two of them continue to work going forward in terms of making this construct clearer and clearer, both in a formal sense as well as a practitioner sense.
Excellent. Promotion. Just 5 minutes more, Brad, and I know that you're super busy, and then I let you go. Promotion. I was interested and intrigued in this topic because I really don't like traditional marketing, and I think a lot of businesses till in 2012 they keep on doing traditional press release and marketing the old fashion. And I heard you talking about different kind of marketing and delighting your users. I loved also this phrase. And so I would like you to give us also maybe some example of companies. You investing in so many companies, you know so many startups. So maybe you could give us some example of marketing done in the right way without sucking at it.
Yeah, I think a great example is actually a company called GNIP, GNIP. The COO, Chris Moody, wrote a guest blog post on Feld.com a while ago about thought leadership as the essential way to do marketing. And I thought it was really right on the money, which is this notion, and it was very insightful because Chris played it back to me as the way that I was essentially marketing a lot of the things that I care about. And he was very much right, which is that instead of creating a message and trying to shove that message down people's throats, or creating some thing and then promoting, the better thing to do is just lead with progressive thinking, lead with your ideas, be articulate about what you're doing, stay on those, and actually do what the ideas are and link them together. So if you think about startup communities and the Boulder thesis, I mean, this has come out of my experience, but it's very easily applicable. If you look at GNIP as a company, they're very, very clear about what they're doing as a business, and they're constantly pushing the edge intellectually of what's going on with real-time social data and how companies can use and work with it. And they're not promoting a bunch of stuff that doesn't exist. In fact, they have a whole bunch of products that they're not even promoting, because what they're trying to do is make sure that the potential customer universe understands the importance of what they do and the importance of the relevance of different aspects of the kinds of things GNIP can enable. They spend a lot of time on thought leadership. Big Boulder, which was a conference that GNIP had, where basically they brought a bunch of their customers and a bunch of their partners to Boulder, was an unbelievable experience, because instead of it being a trade show for GNIP's products, it was a conversation over 48 hours that engaged about 200 people that were working hard at this problem. And I think that kind of activity is so much more valuable, and frankly, as humans, it's so much more stimulating. There's only so much, buy this, do that, love this, care about that any of us can take. But when it's a chance to actually engage in real thoughts, it's pretty fun.
It's cool. I think organizing an event is a cool way of become authoritative in your topic. I was thinking, when you were speaking, I was thinking about Loic Lemoore. Now he sold Seismic, but in the end he organized the largest event in Europe. So, and in this way, I mean, he created a great network, and then he was building up from there.
Loic's another great example. I mean, he provides incredible thought leadership. He stimulates the community to come together, and then he facilitates additional discussion that drives more thought leadership, rather than, hi, look at me, I have a trade show for startups in Europe, come. Like, okay, whatever. Maybe that would be interesting, but it's so much more interesting to be with a bunch of compelling people that you're spending your time.
Absolutely. Another example is also Rand Fishkin. I think you're investing in SEO mods. Rand is a good friend of mine. He also been in Italy, and they are really a strong community. I saw they organizing this mods conference. So event can be good, and try to apply a different approach. How do you handle? Sorry.
I think that's another great example. I mean, Rand and SEO mods are intermingled, right? Rand spends an enormous amount of time running around helping people understand what it is that SEO mods can do, but not to sell you the product, but to help you be much more effective at what you're doing in the context of your own web marketing and web development. And then, of course, SEO mods is a tool that you can use for that. But the mods community is incredible in terms of information, and connectivity. So that's another really good example of an entrepreneur who's just internalized it.
Yeah, also this Whiteboard Friday where they explain every Friday, they teach, so they do a lot of education. Excellent. How about you, Brad? I mean, you have a huge following on Twitter, for instance, and you have to also promote your books and so on. How do you handle? I mean, you have so many things to do, and I saw the list of social media where you are on. tones. How can you handle all this? What kind of advice can you give to people or business who has to handle their online identity today, and every 2 seconds a new social network appear?
I think I've been playing around with it since the mid 2000s, 2004, 2005 when I started blogging. I can't remember the exact date. But it was in the end of 2004, beginning of 2005 timeframe. I have always viewed this as just living what I'm using. So I started doing it because I'm investing in these technologies, and I didn't believe I could be a credible investor in these technologies unless I was actively using them. So I tend to use them well ahead of when we invest in the companies, and I'm very immersed in the companies of which the technology we use. And so for me, it's not a concentrated effort to I need to go manage my social media presence. I just do what I do. And I do it in a very open way. So I've sort of integrated all of these activities into the work. My job is very simple, right? Our investors give us money, and our job is to give them back a lot more money.
It sounds very simple, very simple.
It's very simple. So as long as the things I'm doing are adding to that, the potential of us generating, economic returns for our investors, it's a good use of time. Part of that is understanding the technology, engaging in the technology. Some of that is promoting the kinds of stuff we do in the companies we do. But I can do it in this way of thought leadership that provides authenticity rather than say, hey, buy my thing. And I'm sure I default into buy my thing sometimes. I'm not by any means perfect at how I do it. But I try to weave it all together so that people see how it can actually be used in the context of your life and your arc as a business or an entrepreneur, rather than just pumping out message all the time.
Excellent. Last question, Brett. 3 tools that you would kindly recommend to everyone who has to do some kind of business online, and you say, gosh, you need to use at least these 3 tools because they are fundamental, they are mandatory to succeed in your business.
I would say when I think about the tools, I would break it into categories. So one category is I've worked extremely hard to tune how I interact with messaging, namely email. And I've always wanted to be a rapid responder and a complete responder. So I use Gmail, and I use a product called Yesware that we are investors in. That's a Gmail plugin.
Tell me again the name.
Yeah, Yesware, Yesware.com is the site. And it does a bunch of things, but really between Gmail and Yesware, my ability to automate and manage my email is pretty dramatic. So I'd say that's one category. A company that I'm particularly excited about that's starting to grow very quickly is a company called Mobile Day. I do a lot of conference calls. I travel constantly. So I use my cell phone almost all the time for this stuff. And if you've ever done a conference call on a cell phone where you have to dial in a bunch of numbers and your head explodes, you're driving down the road and you're trying to look up the number, it just sucks. What Mobile Day has done is it's an app that's a one-click into any conference call. So you literally just use your existing conference call infrastructure, and Mobile Day, whether you're the moderator or somebody else is the moderator, doesn't matter what the conference call service is, it replaces the calendar for all the conference call activity. So that's one that's become indispensable to me of late. It's another company that we're investors in. And then I'd say, I've always been very heavy around WordPress and WordPress-related stuff for content creation. And what I've come to is I think that there's a couple of different approaches to it, but figuring out a single approach and then setting up your infrastructure so that there's no barrier to you creating content, I think is very important. So in my case, I've done it with WordPress. And if you go to any of the sites, you see a bunch of similar stuff, whether you're on Ask the VC or Feld.com or Foundry Group or Startup Rev. And now with Startup Revolution, which is the new site, startuprev.com, around the books, you're starting to see some things like we have what we're calling a hub, which is from a company called Social Engine. that if it works, we'll roll it out to the other sites, right? So some of it is experimenting constantly, but within a framework that's not changing. And in our case, the framework that we chose was WordPress. Those would be the three approaches.
Great, great. I really have to let you go. When you were talking, I have so many things to ask you, Brett. I would stay here 5 hours, but okay, will be next time. You also investing in 3D printing that I'm very curious about, but I saw the price is around $2,000 or something like that, so it's not for consumer, but it's already a good price that you can. Do you think 3D printing will be something that absolutely will spread? Or, yeah, of course you think, but why? I mean, what's happening?
I think that 3D printers are very analogous to laser printers in the 1980s. So in 1984, if you bought a laser printer, you paid $2,000-3,000 for a desktop laser printer. And I actually had one in 1994, one of the early HP laser jets. And if you look at the evolution of that, now you can buy for $200 a printer that's 100 times better than that one that I could buy 20 years ago, or almost 30 years ago now, for $3,000. 3D printers on the same kind of curve, but it's going to accelerate much faster. So the idea that, when I got a laser printer, people said to me, well, why do you need a laser printer? And 4 years later, end of the 1980s, once desktop publishing had started to become ubiquitous, everybody needed a laser printer. So I think we're in that same kind of zone with 3D printing, which is there will be a couple of software applications that become everybody has to have this now. I think we're very close to it, but it's we're within that narrow time band.
Let's see what we have now. All right, Brett, thank you so much for
Marco, my pleasure. This was fun, and holler anytime.
Absolutely. Check Startup Communities and Startup Life. January 2013, I think, is coming out. The book.
Startup Life will be out in January. Yep.
All right. Thank you so much.
Thanks.